So my name is Zach Cole. I am the Outreach and Education Director at the Highlands Coalition. I'll be attempting to moderate this evening's discussion, but more importantly, with me this evening, Dr. Dan Van Abs. He is an Associate Professor for Practice for Water at the Society and Environment at Rutgers University. He has worked there since 2012. Those of you who just watched the movie will recognize him. Following the passage of the Highlands Water Protection and Planning Act, he served as Senior Director and Planning for Planning and Science at the Highlands Water Protection and Planning Council. There he was responsible for overseeing the development and implementation of the Highlands Regional Master Plan, which we'll talk about this evening. Elliot Ruger is my colleague at the Coalition, and Elliot has over 25 years of environmental and historic preservation advocacy experience. He's been with the Coalition since November of 2007. He leads the implementation of our media and educational campaigns, advocates for Highlands resource protection with the New Jersey and US legislators and regulators, and with the Highlands Council. He also provides guidance and support to our grassroots groups working to protect Highlands resources, and he promotes municipal conformance, which we'll talk about as well this evening, with municipal officials and residents. So I'll now open the floor up to questions. Elliot, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I'll start off with a question for Dan. When Highlands Rediscovered was produced, Dan, you were still with the North Jersey Water Supply Authority. There was yet to be a Highlands Council where you ended up being the Senior Director of Planning and Science. And this documentary ends with a quote of yours where you say, "If you know where you are going, we can figure out how to get there. If you don't know where you are going, no map will take you there." And it was a question about the future of the Highlands. And at that time, the legislation, the Highlands Act, had not been passed. But it's been now 16 years since the Highlands Rediscovered premiered on NJN. Much has happened in the intervening years. The Highlands Act was passed. DEP adopted its responsive rules as directed by the legislature. A Highlands Council was formed, and they drafted it and adopted a very forward-thinking Highlands Regional Master Plan. And we've been through several administrations in Trenton, some friendly to the Highlands and some very unfriendly to the Highlands. And we've also had the economic downturn of 2008. So have we figured out what we want from the Highlands? Do we know where we are going, and have we made the right choices?
Okay, so there are a lot of different answers to that, and it really comes down to the legislation set the path. So the Highlands Water Protection and Planning Act of 2004 set the path for where the state wanted to go. That's official policy. Legislature passed it, the governor signed it. And so it gives us a broad brush sense of where we want to go with the Highlands. And where we want to go with the Highlands from the law's perspective is two places. One is protection of the resources, protection of the ecological resources, the water resources, and so on. But the other is protection of communities within the Highlands, so that those communities have the ability to maintain themselves and be viable. We weren't really talking back in 2003, 2004 a lot about the term sustainability. But when you think about it, that's really what it has to be all about. It has to be about environment and the economy and the social fabric of the area. I'd say the law is probably stronger on the environmental side of things. It is less strong with regard to community sustainability, and it says almost nothing about the social side of things. So I think we have part of the answer, but not the entire answer as to where we want to go and where we need to go.
That's very interesting and topical, because I see in the Regional Master Plan some very powerful tools for municipalities or communities neighborhoods that want to hold on to their very fragile and precious community character, which they do speak about in the Regional Master Plan. Yet because of the I don't know if I can pronounce this, politicization of the Highlands Act, many municipalities have not embraced conformance, and really it provides them with a tool to be able to retain the character they so much want to hold on to, and which is so threatened by overdevelopment. And we see it today in Warren County with these proliferation of warehouse proposals. And these are, Warren County sued the state that the Highlands Act was unconstitutional. Yet the Highlands Regional Master Plan provides the tools that will help them preserve what they want to preserve as far as the character of their communities.
Right. So part of the difficulty, and I've seen this, my dissertation was on regional environmental management. I studied the Pinelands program in South Jersey. I studied the Adirondack Park program in New York State. And it is almost inevitable that when the state says you must, that local governments, some local governments, not all of them, will react very negatively to that, even if what the state is demanding they do is something they wanted to do in the first place. But the fact that the state tells them to do it, they react negatively to that because of the home rule tradition. But there are other communities that really weren't thinking regionally, perhaps not even now are thinking regionally. They're thinking in terms of what's going on in their community and what they want for their community. And they're not really thinking beyond their borders or how what they do ties into everybody else. That's an ongoing problem. They have it still in the Adirondacks. That act was passed in 1971, so 8 years before the Pinelands program and many years before the Highlands program. So they're still having these problems. They're still having these fights, and I'm sure that we're going to have the same thing continue in the Highlands for quite a while, trying to convince people that there are ways of using the regional master plan that can be beneficial to the communities.
Yeah. I had a discussion last week with a farmer in White Township whose property is in the preservation area. And, on one hand, he really is hostile towards the Highlands Act and how it had constrained his economic opportunities. Yet he's also working with us to help preserve the nature of their town that is being threatened by these mega warehouses and wants to work with us.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yep. One of the things that was really difficult when the Highlands Act was passed and during my time on staff at the Highlands Council was recognizing we almost immediately, well, actually, when we were adopting the Highlands Plan, the economy was tanking. Started in late 2007. The plan was out for public comment. And then in 2008, everything went just completely sideways with regard to the economy. The bottom fell out of the development market. So nobody was building anything anywhere. And when you have those impacts and also the existence of the Highlands rules and the Highlands Plan, how do you tease out the difference between what's affecting market value? Is it the economy? Is it the plan? The other thing that happened, of course, is that it really constrained the state's ability to fund land preservation. And so the Highlands Council passed resolution after resolution asking the state legislature to provide additional funding for land preservation so that people could, who were basically stuck, they could sell out their property, they could sell the development rights for their farms. And so it's only in recent years with the passage of the permanent funding for the state Green Acres program and the Ag Preservation program, that we now have the ability to sort of work our way backward toward this issue and have funding come on a routine basis, some of which will go to the Highlands. So it took a long time, but I look at the Pinelands program, and one of their marquee programs is the Transfer of Development Rights program in the Pinelands. It took years for that to get started and get to the point where people were getting value back for their property after the regulations were put in place. And so we're having the same thing happen here in the Highlands. But I'm finally pleased, to see the level of funding that the state is putting into land preservation. And I hope that it's going to settle some of those issues that you're talking about with regard to farmers and other landowners in the preservation area.
Thank you for those questions and that discussion. First of all, we have our first questions coming in through the chat feature, and we are live on Facebook as well, and some questions will be coming in from there. The first question is from Julia Summers. Those of you not familiar, Julia is also our colleague at the Highlands Coalition. Her question is for Dr. Van Abs. What arguments would you use to try to persuade towns why conformance, municipal conformance, is in their best interest?
So this is a critical issue, and I will say that the Highlands Regulations and the Highlands Regional Master Plan have very different effects depending on which municipality you are. Are you a Parsippany on the east edge of the Highlands where much of the land that can be developed has already been developed? Are you an Independence Township out in Warren County rather, where there's a considerable amount of agriculture and open space and so on that is now within the preservation area? Very different situations. So my simple answer is that not all towns are ever going to be convinced, is my best bet, that the Highlands Plan and the Highlands Act are in their best interest, because they see themselves as constrained. They want to be different than they currently are, and they cannot be that different. So that's an issue that we're going to have. For many other towns, though, it's more a matter of finding ways that they can accomplish what they're looking to accomplish for their people in a way that also preserves the resources of the Highlands. And that's a back and forth kind of process between the Highlands staff and the municipalities to see what can be worked out that is, in fact, beneficial to both the resources and the municipality. So the biggest way one persuades towns to go through conformance is by talking with them. And unfortunately, for a period of years, the council seemed to be constrained from talking with people, and now is out there, from what I understand, doing a lot of conversations with municipalities. And then finding out what they're really looking for. And in my field, we differentiate between needs and desires. And a municipality may desire certain things, but they need certain things. And if you can satisfy their needs, then they may change their desires. And that's, I think, a valid approach to this process.
Yeah, it's a subtle distinction. For those not familiar, conformance, and the experts will make sure my definition that I use is correct. Conformance is the procedure wherein a town makes sure its development ordinances are in line with the regional master plan for the area. And in its most simple form, it's through municipal conformance that the broader goals of the regional master plan are met. So it is important that towns buy in at some level that's appropriate for them, for the Highlands Act, the Water Protection and Planning Act, to ultimately be successful. So I don't know if it's a guarantee that every town will buy in eventually, but maybe a tailored approach for some towns might be another way of pursuing that. What would be your reaction to that?
Yeah, I imagine some towns will go back and forth over time because the leadership changes, what they're hoping for changes. And so some who have been friends will wind up deciding to go the other direction, and some who have been adamantly opposed will turn around and say, that doesn't sound too bad. I think we can do that. So I fully expect that it will be in situation in flux for a very, very long time.
Indeed. So while we wait for a couple more questions to come in, I'll read another one from the chat. The coalition has become aware recently of a number of warehouse developments that are coming up, and they're getting passed as a result of exemption number 4s. So the coalition, we are frustrated by some of the exemptions that the RMP provides for. Another example is the exemption of forestry in the Highlands, which we see being unevenly applied or applied in different ways throughout the region. Do either of you have advice on how we can tackle this issue of exemption number 4? Elliot, go ahead. You're muted.
There we go. Well, exemption 4 is particularly problematic because the language is very vague. And in fact, it has been litigated, and the courts have begged the Highlands Council to come up with some defining language, which they have not yet done. Exemption 4 is the reconstruction of structures up to 125% of the existing footprint of impervious surfaces up to 1/4 of an acre. And they say reconstruction for any purpose. I think that's the term they use, but it doesn't, that doesn't necessarily mean for any land use. I mean, would you take a former barn and for any purpose, does that mean justify now we can build a nuclear power plant? We feel there has to be some relationship with the former use that what we think the language meant was for any reason that caused you to reconstruct, you may do so, but it doesn't mean for any land use. And exemption 4 is one of those that municipalities can be certified to give directly to the applicant after undergoing a training program that's administered by the Highlands Council. And we've seen there's a problem with that because if DEP issues an exemption, there's a public process. The application is noted in the DEP bulletin, the public is notified, and they have an opportunity to comment. But when it's granted by the municipality, there is no public process.
Can you maybe list some examples that we've been dealing with currently of where exemption number 4 is being misinterpreted or has been misinterpreted?
Well, it happened in Bethlehem Township in Hunterdon County when a asphalt recycling plant that had not been in operation for a decade or so. So it's questionable whether it was grandfathered under the Highlands Act, but it was granted an exemption by the municipality, and there was a complaint filed by a citizens group representing an attorney, and DEP agreed and took the exemption delegated authority away from the municipality, and the applicant had to reapply. But we would like to see that be that there be better language written, a better interpretation of the exemption, and that there be some public participation option when the municipality accepts an application for exemption 4.
Right. Would you like to add anything to that, Dr. Van Abs?
I was just taking a quick look at the exemption, and I will tell you that it's been 8 years since I've dealt with the intricacies of the Regional Master Plan, and I very deliberately have stepped aside from Highland Council or Highlands activities because, as former staff person, I have a lot of potential conflicts of interest. So I try to avoid that. Exemption 4 was very deliberate on part of the legislature. The notion was that if you have an existing land use, you have an existing disturbance of an area, that you should be able to redevelop that. But it says reconstruction of a building or structure. It does not say you can get to tear it down and replace it with something that was not there. It says very specifically reconstruction of a building or structure. And so the question then is, what can be considered reconstruction? It does say for any reason, which means that you can change it from one type of commercial structure to another type of commercial structure if the local zoning agrees. You can change it from residential to commercial if the local zoning agrees. It does say you can't reconstruct an agricultural or horticultural building for non-agriculture or horticultural uses. So you can't take a big barn and turn it into I won't use a brand name, a convenience store. All right, so that's in there. But I have not dealt with this notion of delegating this to municipalities. So I can't speak to that issue at all.
It's obviously working out differently in different municipalities, depending on their existing ordinances and what their priorities are.
Well, that's very typical. And you see that also with things like stormwater ordinances, where the municipality will adopt a stormwater ordinance and then the zoning board will give a waiver to a provision of the stormwater ordinance, even though it really isn't supposed to.
Yeah. So on this subject, I have a question as well. While we're talking about implementing the rules that are written, what about some of the information that we have now about climate change, for example, that isn't in the Act or the RMP? And how about also, you touched on this in your opening remarks to do with sustainability, but what about a blueprint for how energy will be produced throughout the Highlands? I'd be curious to know what your reaction is to those subjects, particularly in light of how much more information we have since those documents were produced and passed.
True. We do have quite a bit more information. I will say with some pride that Rutgers faculty have been very much involved in this whole issue with regard to climate change. The Rutgers Climate Institute, the New Jersey Climate Adaptation Alliance that is staffed through Rutgers. So we know quite a bit more than we did before. But at the same time, so many of the impacts of climate change are a little bit more difficult than things, for instance, like sea level rise. Highlands is not going to have to deal with sea level rise. If we ever get to that point, then we've got a lot worse problems to deal with than the Highlands Act. What we're going to see is warmer temperatures, which means that we're going to start seeing a shift in forest structure. We will likely see more dry periods where forest fires are possible in the Highlands. We are already seeing more severe storms hit. More of our rainfall is coming down as severe storms. And so that changes how our stormwater infrastructure needs to work. So much of our stormwater infrastructure was not designed for these kinds of storms, not designed for this frequency of storms. So there are a lot of things that will need to be addressed from that perspective. I don't think that we will see, based on climate change, a need for wholesale changes in the land use capability zones in the Highlands Regional Master Plan, things of that nature. It's more a matter of how we manage land resources, how we manage water resources, than where we put development, is my thought on that.
And I'd like to add to what Dr. Van Abt said, Zach. And there are two considerations that we have to ponder, and one is the value of Highlands forests, the recognition for their ability to sequester carbon, and how they can do that most efficiently and effectively, and are they adequately protected for that purpose, for one. And there is, I believe there'll be a sociological impact when sea level rise occurs in New Jersey, when large areas of land will no longer be habitable, and people will have to migrate to uplands, and how we will receive them in the Highlands may be a challenge.
Absolutely, yeah. The Highlands will become very desirable area to be in.
So, Zach, one of the things that you also mentioned was energy production. Mm-hmm. And that certainly has been an issue, is going to be an issue, because there are, especially in the southern portion of the Highlands, many farms. And the question then is, if they are not preserved farms, what's the potential for them to go over to, for instance, solar energy production facilities and such? And that isn't a statewide issue. It's a regional issue. It's a very significant issue. I would certainly hope that New Jersey as a whole, as a state, is able to figure out ways of using the millions of square feet of, for instance, warehouse space that we have along the Route 1 corridor and the Route 130 corridor and so on, to generate solar energy, as opposed to putting it out in farms where it's distant from the main power lines, it's distant from the users, and it would take green space and turn it into solar panel space. So this is something that is beyond the Highlands. This is an issue that needs to be dealt with at a statewide level to make it work, so that we're making efficient use of land.
Exactly, and it's all about producing and encouraging a sustainable economy as well. That's how I like to phrase it. It's a sustainable economy which doesn't come at the cost of limiting people's freedoms or ability to do different things, but rather doing the right things in the right places.
If you think about it, the notion of developing sustainable energy in a dirty way makes no sense.
Yeah, it's often something that we have to hash out at public meetings with people. So on the subject of a sustainable economy, we talk often about, and this builds on this idea of preserving farmland as well. We talk about what a sustainable Highlands might look like, and we champion recreation a lot as well. I don't know if either of you would like to comment on what your vision of a truly sustainable economic plan might be for the Highlands region that both encourages people's livelihoods but also protects those resources.
Well, I think that one of the potential economic drivers of the Highlands, and it would behoove municipalities that are located far away from population centers and where it's not easy to commute to the major urban areas, to try to leverage the recreational opportunities that the Highlands are really quite wonderful for providing. I mean, it was in the 1992 Forest Service study, which was one of the precursors to the Highlands Act, which said that more people visit the Highlands, and they meant New York and New Jersey, the Highlands region, each year for whatever reason, but we assume recreation, than Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Grand Canyon combined. So there is a tremendous amount of use of the Highlands for recreation, and it's accessible to everybody in New Jersey, to our major population areas in Philadelphia and New York City, and that could be leveraged more than it is.
One of the things that we need to recognize is that the Highlands is a mix of developed community types. And so there are some that are fully developed and right, as Elliot was saying, right within the commuter shed and so on. And there are many that are very small towns. They grew up as either farm center towns, places where the surrounding farmers would come to do business, or they grew up as mining towns. Now that's going back a long way. That's going back all the way into the 1800s. Those towns no longer have those functions. And so the question is, how do those small centers, places like Califon, places like Hampton and so on, transition into something that is going to be viable long-term and has a function that does not require a large-scale development, does not require that they become a Morristown, which has its own vitality and its own signature lifestyle. So that's a really interesting issue. And I will say that most state agencies, and I would think the Highlands Council is among them, are really not all that well versed at dealing with that kind of economic development question. And so this is a place where the Highlands Council and the municipalities and everybody else involved in the process needs to be developing collaborations with the folks who really have an understanding of how small towns work economically. And that could mean reaching out to places like Vermont and New Hampshire and other states where they've been doing this work for quite a long time. It's a very difficult situation. It's not going to be an easy process, but I think it's a worthwhile one because these towns they all have their own ambiance, their own style, their own sense of place. And if we lose that sense of place, if we lose that value, New Jersey is going to be poorer for it.
It's a challenge it's a challenge every urban center, I think, faces. And there are some examples. Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania springs to mind, where an old town that served a very industry-heavy function in the past has completely reinvented itself as a sustainable destination, or a destination for a green economy. But that didn't come easily. It's something that the town had to work very hard for, and different resources are at play. But there are examples of towns that have succeeded, but every urban area will ultimately have to, I guess, come to terms with some of these questions soon.
Right, but I'm thinking also of the small places. I mean, Pittsburgh Indeed. Has the advantage that it's a regional city. It's the only regional city in their area. They have the medical facilities, and they have the universities, and they have the business finance community, and so on. But if you go to Boonton or Blairstown, or any number of the small communities, how are they going to make that transition in the next 30 years? It's very different because they don't have those internal resources.
Well, I believe one of the poster child municipalities for exactly what you're talking about, Dan, is Boonton, which I'm talking from right now, and where the Highlands Coalition's headquarters is located. And this is a town that grew because of the mining in the Highlands. All told, there were 512 mines in the Highlands between the late 1600s and the mid 1960s. And Boonton grew because of the iron mining, and that the Morris Canal went through Boonton, and there was an inclined plane here where these boats would queue and needed to be serviced. And they decided to build an ironworks, and there were 2 furnaces here. And this was quite a smoking, belching town at one point. And the entire town was built around those operations. And there's a heritage tourism aspect which we are trying to promote here, and use state and county funding to interpret the remnants of those operations that occurred here. So some towns are getting it, but really the whole story of how northern New Jersey developed can be told right in this little community, which also serves as a town center for all of the neighboring towns that don't have a main street. They all come to Boonton. So it has a bunch of different things working in its favor. It's just a matter of money and will to leverage them and to make this a vital community.
Well, if that's all it takes, then no problem, right?
We're working on it.
Yeah.
We are
Okay.
indeed. Another question's come in. One of the big topics last summer was the issue of harmful algal blooms in New Jersey, and Lake Hopatcong, Greenwood Lake, and other Highlands lakes all experienced HABs, as they're referred to, through 2019, late into 2019. In your guys' opinion, how could the Highlands help communities prevent HABs in the future? I mean, is there a role that municipalities could be taking, and what role might the council have as well, do you think, in intervening on this issue?
So there are several parts to this. Certainly these, well, they're not really algae blooms, they're cyanobacteria, but harmful cyanobacteria blooms doesn't roll off the tongue very well. And they're driven by a combination of nutrients, which are from land uses. They're not from the forest, they're from urban developed land uses and stormwater runoff and so on, and stagnant water and heat. So you put those three things together, you're likely to have these blooms. So what do you need to do about them? Well, one thing New Jersey has already done was pass a legislation a few years ago regulating the amount of phosphorus in fertilizers. And phosphorus is the big nutrient that causes these blooms. So we're in a process now of reducing the amount of fertilizer, the amount of phosphorus that we use in our fertilizers. The problem is our existing suburban soils already have too much phosphorus in them. And so when you get runoff, when you get erosion, you get the movement of the phosphorus in, then you have a problem. You can also have a lot of phosphorus that's already in the lake because of years and decades of runoff into the lakes. So the thing that we can do is continue to put a downward pressure on how much we use in the way of fertilizers. The notion that if one bag is good, 2 bags isn't twice as good. 2 bags can be twice as bad. The second is all of our stormwater infrastructure in these older developed areas that were developed post-World War II or even prior to World War II, has no control with regard to water quality. And so what we really need to be doing is modifying our stormwater systems so that they do 2 things. One is they better treat the stormwater before it goes into our lakes. And second is, as long as we're modifying these stormwater systems, we should also deal with the fact that the storms we're getting are stronger and more, are causing a lot more runoff. So that's green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, trying to mimic the natural environment, slow down the stormwater, cleanse it before it gets out into the open waters. That's going to take quite a bit of time. That is not an easy lift. That is the sort of thing that will take decades of time. But if we start now, then we will hit the end of those decades sooner. If we don't start for 10 years, then we've just put off the issue and we're going to have more blooms. That's all there is to it.
And there is additional legislation that was passed last year allowing municipalities or groups of municipalities or counties to form stormwater utilities, which could collect fees based on the amount of a property's impervious surfaces. So really it's equitable in that the onus is on those who contribute to the problem to help fund the solution, and that those fees collected would go to green infrastructure projects to intercept the nutrients before they enter the lake. But again, this is something that's become very politicized in the districts around the legislative districts around Lake Hopatcong. Those legislators term this a rain tax, and they've been pressing their municipalities to pass resolutions promising never to collect a rain tax. And they look at the state to fund whatever is necessary to correct the problem. And I don't think that is the solution, because I don't think the state is willing to fund what has been really the decades of local land use decisions that have allowed this to come to the critical situation we have today. I believe it will be a equal participation between the municipality and the state to aggressively deal with this by collecting money to implement green infrastructure.
One of the things that's worth looking at is we are now dedicating, what is it, about $120 million a year to open space acquisition and farmland preservation and so on. The state currently puts about 3 or 4 million, or a little bit more than that, into the control of what's called non-point source pollution, the pollution that doesn't come out of pipes. That's a really stark mismatch. And it tells me that we've definitely been very successful at getting people to recognize the value of open space. But we have not yet been successful at getting people to recognize the value of clean water and the cost of it. I think municipalities would be a lot more likely to pony up some dollars if they were doing so as matching funds to state dollars. Mm-hmm. But that requires not just a few $1 million a year, that requires tens of millions of dollars a year. And we're not there. So I think that would be a worthwhile advocacy role for the municipalities to play, and also for environmental organizations to play, is try to get really serious about clean water in the state of New Jersey. We are not really serious about it. We're serious when it comes to something that we can regulate, things like sewage treatment plants and industrial wastewater discharges and so on. They're easy to regulate, relatively speaking. But we're not serious about it when it comes to the pollutants that are harming the vast majority of our waters in the state.
I agree.
Why do you think that is? Why is that mismatch? I mean, I think no one would argue against the value of clean water, but are they willing by nature to get with the program? I don't think so. And I don't understand that. So
I've been watching this for a long, long time. And my simple answer is, when you're talking about the treatment plants, the wastewater treatment plants, whether they're public or industrial or whatever, there are a very manageable number of them. They all have a revenue flow. And so it is easy to require them, and I'm saying easy, it's not easy, but it's relatively easy, to require them to take action, at which point the state is not spending the money. Somebody else is spending the money. So that's easy. When it comes to non-point sources and it comes to stormwater systems and so on, you're talking about, well, how many people are there in the state of New Jersey? About 9 million people. So you have 9 million non-point sources, us, and then you have all of the roads, and you have all of the properties and all of the land uses and so on and so on and so forth. It's very, very difficult to regulate something like that and force somebody else to do something. Instead, it's a we issue instead of a they issue. And we're much less willing to regulate ourselves than we are to regulate bad people, the other people.
You know, I see that in the recent, DEP just recently adopted the 600 miles of streams that were upgraded to Category 1 waters. And in the 333 written comments that DEP received, some of them in opposition to these upgrades, that came from chambers of commerce governing bodies of some towns who felt that their economic development would be stymied if a riparian buffer went from 150 feet to 350 feet on a stream that went through where they had hoped to develop. And I thought that was rather disingenuous, because we all know the long-term economic value of clean water. And it's not as if we're trying to make this water cleaner. The C1 designation is recognizing the existing good quality of the water and determining not to degrade it. It's not trying to restore it. It's just protecting where it is today. And that so many people with certain interests felt that hampered their economic opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very typical and very human nature for people to say, I absolutely want clean water and somebody else should do something about that. Right? It's very typical of human nature. And government should pay for it. Well, where does government get its money? Right. I tell my students that government gets its money. It's all OPM. You know what OPM is? Other people's money.
Yeah.
Right? Government has no money of its own. It gets its money from us. And so when you say government should do this, you're saying we should do this. Well, if we're saying we should do this, then let's recognize it and do it. But that's not how people tend to think.
Question from the floor, is that possible?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Susan.
If you have a floor, ask it.
Susan Haig with Civic Story. Thanks so much for this dialogue. Dan, I wondered if you could speak to the possibilities now of a kind of dialogue, because people have a chance to associate health with sustainability and with the earth and with our natural resources in a way that there hasn't really been time for. So we're just starting to work with 6 reporters in the New Jersey Sustainability Reporting Hub. And I'm wondering if you can simply maybe mention your top 3 or 4 underreported stories that would be a way to start a very broad public dialogue that points to this value of clean water that really has to come from the people appreciating it. What would you tell reporters as a way to get at these are complex stories, but they need to be shaped as news stories in order to really get out to the broad public?
Well, certainly the basic one is that everybody drinks our water. That water that we get in our taps came from someplace fairly local. It didn't come from, in most cases, it didn't come from someplace hundreds of miles away. It came from someplace tens of miles away. Mm-hmm. You think of Newark, you think of Jersey City, all of their water is coming from 30, 40 miles away. That's it. It's not like it's out in upper New York State or Western Pennsylvania or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's very local. And so I just, I did a program yesterday morning with Rutgers environmental stewards through the Rutgers program. And I asked them, did they know where their water came from? And some did, but many of them did not. Mm-hmm. And so that making that connection, where does my water come from, leads to the question of, okay, but who's protecting it? Mm-hmm. And once you make that connection, then people start thinking, well, how are they protecting it? And are they protecting it enough? And what should be done to protect it better? So I think making that very personal connection between I drink this water from there is a fundamental question that we need to get that story out. Mm-hmm. There are very few resources that I have ever seen that allows people to make that connection easily. Mm-hmm. You know, just a simple website, you click on your municipality and up pops the information as to where your water comes from. Doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. And it should, because it'd be a great public education tool.
It sounds so logical. And given the amazing quality of environmental work done by so many nonprofit environmental organizations and universities, but we're this huge patchwork. Can you see any quick aggregation of resources to make that happen? We certainly have the technical, we have the information, there's the technical capability, but now there's this gift of time that we normally wouldn't have. And I'm just thinking there's this time to practice new ways. And my sense is people are really rethinking and would be receptive to this kind of information now.
It's true that all of this information is available in probably 4 different pots of information. And it would take a certain amount of effort to pull it together. And then it would take a different kind of effort to make it available on a website, for instance. But you would need somebody who understands the systems, understands where to get to the information, but then you need people with technical skills who can put it together in a way that makes it really visible and easy for people to use. And that's, I think, in many ways, the complicated part of it.
Enter the Highlands Coalition and our cohort of Highlands advocates. We're doing their bit. On our website, Susan and others as well, we have a couple of training slides with resources for how to stand up in your community for some of these issues that we're talking about. And I'm reminded, Dorothy earlier commented with regard to the HABs that everyone plays a role. And so the Highlands is both a resource to us, it's a geographic area, but it is also, I forget the population of the Highlands, but it's a huge number of people, New Jersey residents, and people like me who are just passing through. I'm a resident too now. The people make up the Highlands as well, and we all have a role to stand up for this beautiful part of the state, this critical part of the state. People matter. People count too.
Great, thanks.
Well, you know, it's a little complicated. I mean, if we compare New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, to the city of New York, the city of New York has one water company, and we know where their water comes from. There's a reservoir in, I think, in one of the Putnam County or something, and then it's the Catskills. We have in New Jersey hundreds of water utilities that are privately owned, that are semi-public, that are government authorities, and they're large and they're small. And some of them it's difficult to track where the water comes from, but it certainly can be done. But it would be a lot easier if we were more like New York City.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned, I just wanted to come back to the chat. Somebody mentioned the notion of Lake Apacong and the fact that it is state-owned. Let me emphasize that all of the surface waters of the state are state-owned, or rather they're public trust resources, and they're held in trust by the state. And so the state government has a responsibility for it, but all of the waters, and I don't care if it's Lake Apacong or Lake Musconetcong or Greenwood Lake or the reservoirs or any pond anywhere in the state, they are all public waters. And so that really is a critical point to make, because that's not a reason for Lake Apacong to be considered distinctive. It is just one of hundreds upon hundreds of lakes that have the waters of the state within them. So what we do for Lake Apacong, the same issues apply to every other lake in the state, and we should be thinking about them that way.
Absolutely. So that brings us to about 5 to 7. Not seeing any other questions, I would turn it over to people one last time before I thank Dan and Elliot for taking the time this evening, and all of you as well for joining in and making this such an interesting and lively discussion.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Sure.
And I'm thrilled that many of you were able to watch the movie again. It, like Elliot, I don't think I've seen it quite that many times, but I watch it about once a month, and I never grow tired of seeing it. And I'm also thrilled that many of the faces in that movie are still just as engaged, Dan being one of them, Wilma Fry. There are countless. Yeah. They are my colleagues today, 20 years down the line.
I was going to mention that because
Tremendous.
I watched it for the first time in years, actually. I haven't watched it recently. And I was remarking to my wife that all of the people who were interviewed, except for one, are still not only with us, but actively engaged in these issues. So we keep on going, and I'm not sure how long that's going to last, but it's good fun. I have fewer hairs and more gray than I used to. That's for sure.
Testament to both the challenge and the importance of what we're trying to do here, I think.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, very good. So thank you all. This did broadcast live. So if you would like to go back and watch this from the beginning again, you are able to. And I recorded it as well, I believe. So we'll have this discussion saved, and we'll try to distribute it as well as best we can. Thank you all, and we'll hope you join us again sometime. Good night, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.